Councilmember Zac Blanchard is a devoted father, veteran, and dedicated public servant. Prior to being elected to Baltimore City Council, he was president of Federal Hill Neighborhood Association, served as the design committee chair of Federal Hill Main Street, and was the vice president of economic development at the Midtown Community Benefits District. With this all said, I encourage everyone to give a warm welcome to Councilmember Zac Blanchard, and I'm going to stop sharing. And Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bella. And thanks to our attendees this morning. We've done a bit of a double header this week. We had a session yesterday. We had a webinar on how Dallas passed landmark parking reforms in 2025, and now we're moving northeast to talk about how Baltimore did so. So Zac, wonderful to have you today. I'd love to start out by asking you about your origin story. You know, what was your path to public office?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And great to be here. And I remember meeting with Parking Reform Network to kind of get some ideas and pick y'all's brains as we were putting this bill and the housing package that this was part of together. So it's cool to be back here, after the bill passed. So I moved to Baltimore in 2020. My wife had been here since 2015. I was in the Marine Corps, trying to find ways to get stationed in the same state as her. And a very big believer in just like the importance of like sense of community, social connectedness, like actually being a part of the place that you live in and knowing your neighbors and all that type of good stuff. And so when we moved to our house just south of the Inner Harbor in Baltimore City, I was very intentional about getting involved in a bunch of different stuff, neighborhood stuff, church stuff. I coach football at the high school in the neighborhood, things like that. And I had a couple of very specific interactions with my predecessor, the incumbent who was office before me, that I found really frustrating and decided to run, and ended up winning with 0.6% of the vote. So 50.3% of the vote. It took a week of all the mail-in ballots coming in for that to get finalized. So the whole like every vote counts. I was a very, very obvious example of that. But yeah, so I didn't run specifically on like urbanism, good living in city type stuff or whatever. But it's a milieu that I've been steeped in for a while. I kind of came into that from the sort of like, what does it mean to like live in a place and with other people, right? And that whole realm of stuff. I remember the first time I read Walkability, and I don't think I'd heard the word before then. I don't think it was a Zillow score yet. And so that's kind of how I came into all this, right? So that's that. And I think there's a follow-on question, Daniel, about how we came to this bill and how we came to the legislation.
Yeah, sort of the genesis of parking reform in Baltimore. And I know that it was part of a broader package of land use reforms that you and Councilmember Dorsey, I believe, spearheaded last year. So,
Yeah,
give us that story.
yeah, absolutely. So it's important to note, maybe the most important context of any is that our bill, my bill, which eliminated parking minimums, it basically kept the parking maximums in place, but eliminated the minimums. It was part of a set of bills, four important ones, that were called the Housing Options and Opportunities Package. And so the whole idea was we want to make it easier for people to live in the type of housing they need, where they want, at a price they can afford. And so there was this bill, but the three other bills, one is a single stairwell reform that allowed up to 6 stories for residential to have a single stairwell, of four units per floor. The second was a lot size and setback, just loosening up those requirements. For example, Baltimore City, I think, is second only to Philadelphia in the percentage of our residents who live in row homes or townhomes, right? Houses that share at least one of their walls with another house. And actually, it basically is illegal to build the types of houses that most Baltimoreans live in anywhere in the city. And so that was like, hey, that's really dumb, and that everyone agrees that's dumb, right? And people would say, yeah, it's really dumb. And so that was that bill. Um, and then lastly, so those three bills have passed, my bill, and then those two housing bills. And then there's a fourth bill that would allow for um, up to four units on any residential parcel in the city, assuming that the lot is large enough, right? So that's basically getting rid of single family zoning and allowing up to four units if the other requirements are met. That bill is being negotiated right now. We'll see if it passes. Um, but so that's the context for it, and there was effort. There was a couple bills last term that were pretty serious about housing reform. Neither of them crossed the finish line. And I think one of them had actually repealed parking minimums as part of the bill. And so coming into this term, me being new to the office, I took office in late 24. Um, the sort of mastermind of the bigger one of the bills became the land use committee chair. And we also had the support of both the mayor and the council president, who are the two most powerful city elected positions. So we had a couple members of the council as well as the mayor and the council president supporting on this already. So that was starting off on a strong foot. But so that's how there was a good amount of negotiating what exactly things would look like. And I'll also say that there was a important to note, also important context, is how much I like saying bite to the apple, like how many exemptions Baltimore already had in place within the zoning code for parking minimums, right? So our neighborhood commercial corridors didn't require any parking. That had been that way for a long time. Downtown didn't require any parking. I think that had been the case since the early 2010s, maybe. The there was multiple sort of situations in the zoning code where if it's a row home and the street is too narrow or the lot size is too narrow and different things like that that were being carved out. Last term, the city council had passed a bill that one required it was an inclusive housing bill saying that if you've got say a large apartment building above 20 units, 10% of those units had to be affordable. And in exchange for like that additional consideration that developers would have to consider, the council passed a bill that basically any of these buildings above 20 units would then be exempt from parking minimums. So we already had a lot of exemptions in place going into the term that really helped made it a little less terrifying to folks who were making that argument of, hey, there's already a lot of things that are carved out, right? So
I've seen, debate in different places over the years about the best way to kind of package parking reform, whether as a standalone initiative, maybe something that, because it can draw these kind of broad, unlikely coalitions, maybe it's better to just go at parking versus bundling it into, we've also seen success with the approach more like what you describe happening in Baltimore, like here's this housing reform package. We've seen that at the city level. We've seen it at the state level in places like Colorado. We're going to do this whole menu of things and it includes parking, and maybe takes some of the heat off of parking as an issue that otherwise people get a little freaked out about. Like, who's trying to take my car away? I'm curious your perspective, from going through it in Baltimore. Was it helpful to the messaging and consensus building around parking reform to have it be part of this broader housing opportunities agenda?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me, I think now's a good time. I'm gonna share in the chat, and then I don't know, am I able to share my screen? Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna share just so folks can see it. Um, and y'all can see this handout, right? The housing options opportunities package. You can see this, Daniel. Okay, great. Um, so this is a handout that I gave to, I went, so as soon as we introduced the package and we had a kickoff press conference, the mayor, the council president, the council members who were supporting it, had a press conference, to introduce the package. Um, and as soon as we introduced it, I barnstormed my district and went to, every neighborhood association and handed out these um, flyers, which I'm happy to, share with whoever. I also put them in the file in chat. But so it was like, here's what this housing options opportunities package will do, right? And I'd said, my wife and I, we moved to the city at that point 5 years ago, or we bought our house 5 years ago for $230,000. Today, the home would probably go for 300,000. If we were moving in now, I don't know where we would live, but we probably wouldn't buy because we wouldn't be able to. Um, so, and talked about there's a largely couched within a housing affordability framework for both owners and renters. And then so I said, this package is going to make home ownership more attainable. It's going to make rent more affordable. It's going to help reduce homelessness. Baltimore City is a very large. We have just under 12,000 blighted homes and about 22,000 vacant lots. Um, so it's going to help in the vacant housing crisis. It's going to grow our population, right? It's going to help set us up for lower property taxes. And then, and it's all free, right? It doesn't cost us any money to do this, right? It's like some miracle drug. And then here's some facts about the situation we're in. And then I had each of the bills. And I said, okay, here's the 5 bills we're looking at. Um, let's take 2 minutes for folks to, read them, and then I'll answer whatever questions you have. And inevitably, about 5 seconds in, someone would try to start asking. I'm like, wait, hang on, let's let everybody read these overviews. And so, they would everybody would read them, and then we'd ask the questions. And it was a really I think it was a really productive way to do it, right? And then we'd have a Q&A. Some neighborhoods it was like 10 minutes and people were like, "Hey, this basically makes sense. I'm glad you're doing something about this," right? Some neighborhoods were a lot more concerned for a lot of different reasons. My district includes both, some neighborhoods that are much more affluent, predominantly homeowner, predominantly older, as well as I have neighborhoods that are um, predominantly renter, below the median income for Baltimore, well below the median income, bottom quartile neighborhoods for the city, which is, has some very real challenges with concentrated poverty. So and all of downtown as well. So kind of the full gamut of the types of neighborhoods that you could have in a city. Um, so all that being said, I'm going to answer those questions. And the kind of the way that I always felt is I knew that, and I was a neighborhood association president, right? So I understand, I think, how they tend to work, at least in Baltimore. Folks tend to be homeowners, longer term homeowners who are on the older side, and almost invariably in any neighborhood you're in, right? And so I knew that these are the folks who are going to be most concerned about proposed changes to the zoning code, and they're the ones who are going to want to be most engaged about this. And so I was very intentional about, like, I'm going to go to these groups first, and I want them to hear from me first. And what I feel like is, if we took a vote of amongst the neighborhood associations of like whether or not they would have individually members would have supported, any of these bills to include the parking bill, um, probably a little less than half would have voted in support of it. But I think what I did accomplish was people say, like, okay, like this isn't how I would do it, but I feel like Zach is. I agree with why Zach is trying to do what he's trying to do, right? Like his heart's in the right place, so I can live with this. We've got sort of other things to be concerned about, you know, and so I think that was really helpful in my district. And I'll say just briefly on the sort of scheming of it. The funny thing about it is, right, like you talk about the stuff in your district as the bill sponsor because you want your constituents to feel good about it, but you know you're already going to vote for it. So you have to get it past the council, right? And I didn't do a lot and kind of it's like norms on the city council about like going and talking in other people's districts and, you know, not crossing lines without being asked to and whatnot. But you know, I think it would have been great had sort of the coalition of bill sponsors for the package, of which I was one, had done more, had done a lot more like proactive community outreach like that across the city. And I certainly would have been more than happy to do it. And I did in a couple neighborhoods who reached out specifically about my bill to ask me about it. But it was just um, I think that made it a lot harder later for council members who may have been sympathetic to the bill, but were getting a ton of pushback because they didn't have anyone come give them a compelling reason for why they were doing it.
Thank you for sharing the handout and talking about that community outreach piece. I'm curious, you know, as kind of a follow up to that. I imagine that part of the work that you did was also working to persuade your colleagues on the council of
Yeah.
some of the stuff. And did you have any particularly challenging or interesting conversations of that nature? You know, what was effective in trying to maybe get past people's initial skepticism?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. So I, with the bill passed 8-6, and we had one member who wasn't there who was a no vote, who would have been a no vote, right? And had voted no on the committee. So I mean, it was we got 8 of 15 votes, right? So it was a um, very close. Um, and we did actually have one yes vote who flips to a no vote without telling me, you know, like in during the vote. So we thought it was a 9-6, but still. Um, the you know, there was probably 5 yes votes going in, kind of before we even started talking to members, right? The but so you know people get feedback from constituents and everything, and so one, we talked about the package as a whole, right, and what this does. Hey, this is about housing. Like, hey, here's all the data about how much the cost of rent is exploding in the city and how the 1,000 different reasons that's bad. We had examples of people trying to, you know, build new homes or rehab vacants and couldn't do it because they had to put a parking space in, right? And it had to go these things like were long, there was lengthening the processes to rehab vacants and doing stuff like that in ways that everyone on the council knew wasn't good. We didn't want that, right? But I'll say besides that, and most specific to the parking bill itself, probably the most important thing for the couple of members who are on the fence who were able to get to yes, besides, to be honest, like my own relationship with those couple of members, which happens to be good when that's incredibly important. Like if we had bad relationships, they would have voted, they would not have gotten yes. And you can't overstate that. Um, but uh, we are currently working on a bill, and I see a Pete Little in here. I don't know if he's the Pete Little from our parking authority or not, but we're working on a bill with our parking authority and our Department of Transportation that would basically we have a residential permitted parking program, and we're working on some reforms to allow for better management of the neighborhoods that have that. So think your denser neighborhoods near the city center, who people are more concerned about parking. And this was something that I think actually I heard first from you guys, that, you know, rewind back a year or whatever. But like what you think is a parking supply problem is oftentimes a parking management problem, and whatnot. And so being able to say, to tell folks, hey, we are other members of the council, like we are actively working. We're getting all this feedback. We want more housing. We're not trying to make the part where we're not trying to make the parking problem worse than it you know needs to be or whatever, right? Like that's not that we're not trying to force people onto bicycles. This is or force people onto bikes and buses or something that a lot of folks who were scared and opposing it were saying, you just want to make everyone ride the bus and bike everywhere. And, that's great, but it's not realistic, stuff like that. And so I said, nope, this is a housing bill. It's a housing first bill. It's a housing first package. This is why we're doing that. Those other goals are great, but it's not, what we're doing this for. And in exchange, we are working diligently to figure out a solution to kind of better manage parking in these sort of denser um, core urban areas.
I emphasize that in the chat, and I'll say, yeah, that the framing that you mentioned there about you have a parking management problem, not a parking supply problem. So helpful. Not even always in like the initial kind of mass public messaging, but in one-on-one, if people have fears about parking, really get that. Well, what is it that you're afraid will happen? I'm afraid I won't be able to find a spot to park my car on the street in my neighborhood when I got bags of groceries.
Yeah,
Okay, well, why would that happen? Like, actually, play that out with people and talk through it. And the vast majority of the time, the problem is not actually that there is a shortage of parking. It's just getting people to see that there are tools other than the hammer to bash the nail to deal
yeah.
with that
I and
fear.
I, I'll say kind of publicly, and to other members, I would say like, hey, we're gonna do what we can to help with that. But the way I framed it was like, at the end of the day, this is like a question of what we want as a city. Do we want to artificially constrain the supply of people who can live in a neighborhood to make it more convenient for folks to park there, right? That was how
Mhm.
I framed that more often, and I think that landed at least with a couple folks in a way that was, and even some of the no votes on the council, I think appreciated my pretty dogged efforts to try to get them to yes. And so hopefully as we're not just done with this, as we continue to consider types of things to change our city, hopefully that helps with those things.
Yeah. I appreciate that you talked about, the relationship that you had with some of your colleagues being an asset. I think that a huge question in doing any kind of politics, whether from in office or outside of office, a huge question is trust. I want to talk a bit about how that played out in a city like Baltimore, which kind of famously is a city that has some really profound divisions within
Yeah.
it between wealth and poverty, divisions in terms of race, in terms of class. How does the trust issue plays out? And when you get someone who, you've got the actual substance of the policy proposal, but you've also got this barrier of someone hearing it for the first time and feeling like um, there's some risk aversion. I think that you see, I've got a neighborhood that I care about. Maybe I've worked really hard to get in a position to live where I live and have the neighbors I have, and I feel defensive of that. And I don't trust. I think you hear that kind of narrative from people.
Yeah.
Um, I don't feel like this is coming from my neighbors. I don't feel like it's from us, and I don't feel like it's for us. And how do you bridge that with people?
That's a great question, Daniel. Um, I think there's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem of like, I think the districts whose members supported this, the kind of a saying about Congress that like no one likes Congress, most people like their Congress member. Um, and I'm sure I'm sure our approval rating is a little higher than Congress's, but it's the same idea, right? Of like your council member tends to be a pretty credible messenger on stuff. Um, and so, but it's hard when you don't have it for the districts whose members were not supporting this or didn't feel strongly enough to, like I'm not gonna stick my neck out on this one, right? It is hard to generate that public support. So I'm not going to, and I'm also not going to pretend like every person in the city is happy that that bill passed. There's certainly folks who are not. Honestly, I think it's less about trust than, I mean, like having I told my staff, um, any person who calls about any bill in this package, get their number. I'm going to call them back myself. Any person who emails about it, put it in its own folder. I'm going to respond to them myself, right? Like I want people to know. And so when, you always get people who post up saying, you're trying to rush this through and you're not doing community engagement and you're not, and so I think it was helpful, at least for me, to be able to say like, hey, actually, I've talked to 20 neighborhood associations. I've emailed over 400 city residents. I've had plenty of calls with folks. Like, I don't know what more I could be doing about this. Um, and while I continue to support this bill, right? Here's this other stuff in this package. Here's these other peripheral things like the parking management sort of reform stuff. There's two main ones that we're looking at where it's like, hey, these are, real and fair concerns that we should pass this package, but we should also address these things. And so that that was kind of how I brought that about. I think it's worth, just because you mentioned like demographic differences. I'll say Baltimore. I think Baltimore is just under 60% Black, just under 30% white, with meaningful Hispanic and Asian minorities populations. So we're basically we're a Black city with a large white minority is kind of the simplest way to frame the city demographically. But what I found, kind of talking about the whole package, is that the most important distinction of who was really opposed to this versus who supported it or just wasn't that concerned about it was it was an age distinction. It was a like if I was talking to someone and they were over 60, um it didn't matter, especially if they were homeowner. If they were older homeowners, this was not the package of bills was not popular with, right? And I think that is a group who has been maybe the least impacted by the rapid increases in housing and whatnot. Obviously, it's an incredibly important group, right? But there's other that makes up probably 20% of the population of the city. And so, younger homeowners and kind of renters of any racial or class background, if you're a lower income renter and you are paying a couple $1,000s more a year for your rent than you were 5 years ago, like my need to explain this to you, it takes like 30 seconds because it's like you probably don't initially, you're like, wait, I don't want to deal with that. And then first off, a third of households in the city don't have a car, so they don't actually care. This doesn't impact them, right? Like they don't look for parking because they don't have a car. Most of these households, because they can't afford one. Um, and so there's that very important aspect of it. And then there's just the demographic split is probably the best predictor, followed by whether someone is an owner or renter. And so I think that I have not found, and my district is 50% white, 30% Black. I am not, so kind of all the sort of racial groups in Baltimore are well represented in my greater downtown district. And I found that the biggest split was generational, and the second biggest was owner renter, which I just think is important when you think about credible messengers and like what people's like sort of concerns and types of lived experience and stuff is.
Yeah, and I think there's research that bears out some of those demographic observations more generally beyond just Baltimore. That age is a big one, owner renter is a big one.
Yeah,
And then you get
I'll say,
the housing reforms in
yeah, and
general.
if and you know I'll say that I think there's a lot of folks, including one online newspaper in the city who like was very intentional on trying to frame this as a racially divisive topic. Um, and it, despite the fact that, our mayor is black, one of the other lead bill sponsors is black, right? Like it was a pretty diverse elected coalition. And despite the fact that the folks who were coming to oppose were very racially diverse, there was definitely some intentional efforts by folks who generally oppose this to frame this in a way that that's just another important consideration when you're talking tactics and whatnot of like being able to say like actually here's what's happening is important.
Right. Yeah. I'd like to get to audience questions, make sure we have some time for that. There was one shared in the chat a little while ago from Max, and I'm going to do a little framing around it. Max said, I'm hoping this webinar can include tactics and strategies that we can use in our own advocacy. So something I always ask when I'm talking to an elected official about local policy change is the advice that you have for on the ground grassroots advocates. What are the things that activists can do that make your job easier or give you space to operate when you're pushing a policy change? And feel free also if you've got any don'ts, what are things that well-intentioned advocates might do that are actually not helpful? Either that are, not that don't move the needle as much or that are actively like not helpful to you as the person trying to ultimately get enough votes on this.
Yeah. Build diverse coalitions. This is like the hardest thing. So there you go, but you got to do it. It kind of going back to this like demographic challenges, right? Like something that, I've certainly seen is a lot of times the folks who are most enthusiastic about these types of reforms, are younger. They tend to be more white leaning, right? Like at least in my experience, has been the case. Um, the um, and you have to be able to convince a diverse set of residents of the city that this is in their interest. And so that being able to actually build that groundswell of support, a lot of this was framed as like bad for seniors, when it was like, well, actually, like a lot of more the seniors drive less than other groups, right? Like seniors are more impacted by higher housing costs and these sort of requirements than other groups, right? Like, but there was a credible messenger, I think, challenge of like it wasn't like there was this broad groundswell of groups, even though the package as a whole, I think is sort of most obvious benefit to people who are renting. Um, the and this goes a little beyond the parking bill itself, but the a renters groups don't have a lot of political influence in Baltimore, and they probably don't have a lot of political influence in most places. But B, I don't think the right amount of like being able to talk through things and come up with ways to get everyone on board and build that trust across these different groups was done super effectively. Um, so that would I and it's hard. Like everyone hangs out with people who have sort of similar vibes to them, and so like it's like you have to be intentional about like, hey, if I want to pass citywide legislation, like I need to get people who look like the city and all of its different components on board with this. So that was, I say, like the biggest thing that I would tell folks working on this type of stuff is really think through how to build that diverse coalition. Um, yeah, that's probably the biggest one. Things I would, um, and the thing I would say to not do is to you don't want people who are you don't want to do the opposite, right? You don't want you don't want a movement to represent a specific sort of demographic, a specific like age and race and class group in a city. And so that is, I think, a challenge that a lot of these types of reforms are probably having across the country, I would think, and certainly um, had in Baltimore.
I think there's certainly the optics challenge of like, who are the easiest people to bring out around land use reform, which is kind of this wonky thing, parking reform, and you often do end up with a bunch of like
Who
young white male urbanist nerds and
Yeah,
tech
yeah. It's
bros,
like
and
it's
there's
like who
kind of
has
a
this type of stuff on their Twitter feed, right? Like that's not
yeah.
um yeah, but kind of go back to my point, right? It's like I found when talking to we have a lot of like larger lower income buildings, or senior, low income senior buildings, public housing and whatnot in the district. Um and it was pretty quick sell to folks. Like it was not, each of the bills, but certainly those like people just a big part of just like people appreciate being reached out to, and like there's a good chance that like everyone who's renting is impacted by the dramatic cost and the price of rent, right? So being able to bring solutions to that is important, right? Being able to talk about why we don't have grocery stores is important. Being able to talk about why we're not walkable and why the transit system is struggling, like all those things are important, and they impact having a good transit system impacts an incredibly diverse set of probably any city. Certainly is the case in Baltimore. So just as an example.
we have a question in the chat about transit, and in particular about the common, form of pushback that you hear to parking reform, which is our transit is inadequate. You need a car to get around in the city. And I mean, we always emphasize, at PRN, we say the first and foremost, like maybe the number one lesson in messaging this is don't make it a referendum on cars. Cars are bad. You should get out of your car. People do drive cars, and this reform is also for those people. We're not trying to take away anybody's car. But I'm curious, did you get a lot of that sentiment in Baltimore, and how did
Yeah.
you respond
Yep.
to it?
Yep. I mean, the number of people I had who say hey Zach, I know you think that like everyone should be biking and taking the bus and stuff like that, and I know you want that, or I know you said that before, and I was like, and I would be like, first off, I've literally never said that. Like I've ne that is never like so that's not true. So I haven't said that. People may have said that as an assumption of what they think I was trying to do. But that's not it, right? And so I always brought it back to housing, which particularly in our case, because it was a bill in a housing package called the Housing Options and Opportunities Package. I think that was a easy, I mean, more intuitive than if it was just a going back to kind of like your first question or one of your first questions, probably more intuitive when it's a set of bills and it's been framed that way. So
We're at about the 45-minute mark. I think if you don't have a hard stop right now, we could tackle one or two more questions, or we could wrap
I
it up.
have, yeah, and I'll answer quickly. Yeah, I got like 5 more minutes.
Sure, sounds great. I want to going off of a question that Barbara shared in the chat. And I'll maybe expand on it just a little bit, but another thing you hear, people get afraid of as soon as you talk about parking reform is, well, if we don't make them build parking, developers are just going to build no parking at all, and it's going to be chaos on the streets. We know there's a lot of evidence from cities that this
Yeah,
doesn't happen. But as parking reformers, we sometimes find ourselves in the position of actually downplaying the importance of our own reform. Oh, don't worry, nothing's actually going to change. There's still going to be plenty of parking. They're still going to build lots and lots and lots of parking. It's not going to change anything. I'm curious, I mean, either about, how, what your substantive response in the case of Baltimore is to that issue, but also like now that you've passed these reforms, kind of looking forward, What are you seeing bubbling up? Are there development proposals happening or kind of entrepreneurship opportunities people are finding in the city that wouldn't have been possible before?
Yeah, great question. So we've seen multiple things that have it was funny. There were bills that were introduced for hey, this we're going to rehab this property and we're going to turn it into a duplex, or we're going to build on this vacant lot and stuff like that. And as part of that, you had to have a variance for the parking minimums, and so that would take several months to go before the council, right? And there was multiple bills for the 2 months after it passed of it was hey, this is actually not necessary because we just passed that, right? And so I think what you'll see is, for at least for us, of a lot of um smaller projects and whatnot just don't have to go before, they're going to happen more because you don't need the 6 months of legislative approvals and things like that, right? And every city handles variances and conditional use and stuff differently. But so I think we'll probably see more stuff on the smaller scale that will just happen, right? Like we have a large scale vacancy crisis that's one of the two or three most important things that need to be tackled in the city of Baltimore. It's just going to get fixed faster because of this, and that's incredibly important. On the higher end, um, I think you'll just see situation you're not going to see outside of downtown. You're not going to see a bunch of big apartment buildings getting built that have no parking. But what you will probably see is instead of having 100 units, they're oh, actually, this didn't really fit, or we needed to add a couple more, or blah blah blah, whatever. And so you'll see 80 or 80 parking spaces instead of 100 parking spaces, right? Removing parking minimums doesn't mean that you don't have to build any parking. It means you get to decide how much parking you want to build, right? And so, the bill passed 3 months ago, and particularly on the high end because of the interest rates and whatnot. There's just not a lot of large large apartment buildings getting built right now, at least in Baltimore. So we haven't seen a great question. Ask me again in 2 years, or for y'all just to do the analysis on in 2 years. But I think probably what we'll see more of there is the flexibility on the lower end with um, your duplex conversions, rehab vacants, buildings on vacant lots, that type of stuff.
Yeah, and that's very much what we've seen elsewhere, what the evidence kind of bears out. Parking reform is really, really impactful and even crucial for the small scale projects working on small lots where you don't have to wait those 6 months now and go through the whole variance process like that. It's completely transformative. For the big stuff, you're working with a different environment. You're building 200 apartments. Your lender is still going to want you to put in parking. The market is going to require you to put in parking. It's rare that you're not going to build any. So getting people to understand that, and also that this really is a reform for the little guy, either the small scale infill housing and for the mom and pop business, where it really is
Yeah,
transformative in terms of the opportunity it creates. I'm
simple as that.
excited to see what happens going forward. To do that analysis a couple years from now, especially to see Baltimore do it, which, as we said at the beginning, you're now the largest city on the eastern seaboard to have no parking mandates at all. And to, a row house city that has a bunch of potential for that kind of small scale infill, really, just miles and miles of tremendous urban fabric. I'm personally really, really excited to see what sorts of things bubble up because of this. Um, the last question in the chat, if you got a minute and want to say anything to it, is from Shelby, asking, following up on some of the earlier discussion about curb management, but
Yeah, yeah, I
are
see.
there plans in place to do more street pricing or street curb management in Baltimore?
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Shelby. And you should, can reach out to Pete Little, director of the Parking Authority, who is, I think he might still be on the call. He was on earlier at least. So we do that with a lot of metered parking, in the city already. We actually just started thinking about what that could look like for residential permitted areas. Um, I haven't thought through that one myself. It's like a new idea to me. Someone else brought it up. it's an interesting idea, but uh, yeah, I will say that something that I'm a huge enthusiast for, and we are working on, is parking benefits districts, where you allow, basically the way it work in the city is you'd allow the parking meters to run a little later, and then use that newly generated revenue to put it towards your main streets and your neighborhood commercial corridors and stuff like that. So that is, we actually have to make a change in our city charter so that way this revenue can go to this, you know, can be spent on this thing. Um, but we are looking to do that in the charter. And so, hopefully I can be back on here in like early 28 to talk about that effort.
We look forward to having you back on in early 28 to talk about that effort,
Awesome.
and to doing
Thanks so much,
whatever
guys, for having me
PRN
on.
can do to help you with that effort in the interim.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, Zac, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been a great conversation. Really impressed by the work you've done in Baltimore, not just with the parking, but with all of the housing reforms and the
Absolutely.
opportunities you've been able to unlock. So thanks so
And
much. Great to have you.
absolutely. Thanks so much for you guys' help, and looking forward to seeing the video that's when it comes out.